Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from the Irish Story website. Please check out our friends at radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps us. If you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We really do appreciate it, and we are so grateful for all the support we get from you, the listeners. On this episode, we're going to be looking back at the life of Ian Paisley, former First Minister of Northern Ireland, founder of the Free Presbyterian Church and the Democratic Unionist Party, and one of the most controversial politicians in Irish history. To discuss the Reverend Ian Paisley, we're very pleased to be joined from New York by Ed Moloney. Ed is the former Northern editor of the Irish Times and the Sunday Tribune. He has written for a wide variety of newspapers and magazines in Ireland, Britain, and the United States. Ed's books include Secret History of the IRA and Voices from the Grave. He co-authored a biography of Paisley with Andy Pollock, and in 2008 he wrote Paisley, From Demagogue to Democrat. Ed, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Ed, could you tell us about the evangelical political Protestantism that Paisley represented? Like, what were the traditions that he was following in, and how did Paisley differ to the types of loyalist figures that had come before him?
Well, actually, he's very much in the tradition of unionist and fundamentalist Protestantism that characterized what later became Northern Ireland. During the latter part of the 19th century, you had this massive revival, which was started in the United States of America and made its way across the Atlantic and came to Ireland. And you had these massive meetings and gospel meetings of one sort or another, people being converted in sort of like mass hysteria. And that sort of set the tone for the politics of the latter part of the 19th century as well in Ireland, when you had the Home Rule movement coming to something of a bit of a climax in the later part of the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century. And Paisley was very much a product or a byproduct of that phenomenon. His father was a Baptist minister. So he came from the Baptist tradition, which is important given his later manifestation as a sort of variant on the Presbyterian faith. And his mother also was a very strong-willed fundamentalist who came from the south of Scotland and came over to Ireland and met his father and married, and they had these two boys. And Paisley was the product of this period, very much so. He was born 5 years after the creation of the Northern Ireland state. His father had been a member of Carson's UVF. So that memory was very fresh in his mind as he was growing up. The UVF was not something as it is now associated with, faded photographs and old movies. It was something very live and living as far as he was concerned. And he came from that tradition. It was his trademark, and it characterized his politics and his religion for the rest of his life.
And Ed, can you talk a little bit about Paisley's idea of an Ulster identity? Was it mostly a religious kind of formulation, or did it have a national aspect? And how did kind of Irish nationalism fit in Paisley's kind of worldview?
Well, Irish nationalism didn't really fit in that sense. I mean, the Irish nationalism was regarded as, the religion of the enemy. It was popery, it was superstition, it was smokes and candles and stuff like that, and entirely foreign. The religion that Paisley was brought up in was a very fundamentalist, basic religion, in which the only book that mattered was the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament. Unlike the Catholic Church, which had all sorts of theological offshoots and manifestations of the Catholic faith, the religion that Paisley was brought up in, and indeed most of his co-religionists and fellow Northern Ireland Protestants, came from the same sort of tradition. Very simple, basic Bible Protestantism is what they believe in. But that doesn't mean to say that there was a uniform attitude towards religion in the Protestant faith. I mean, the Presbyterian Church was riven with all sorts of divisions as Paisley was growing up and becoming, first of all, a teenager and a young man, and then a preacher in his own right. And you had enormous schisms inside the mainstream Presbyterian Church over attitudes towards a liberal moderator called Ernest Davey, who was questioning things like the virgin birth. And these were aspects of the Presbyterian faith, which until then had never been questioned. People just automatically believed that such a thing was possible. Davey, being a much more rational person, sort of was questioning it. And that led to an enormous division inside the Presbyterian Church. And Davey was put on trial. And this was all happening as Paisley was becoming a teenager and a young man. And it affected the way that he formed his own religious opinions. And the Presbyterian Church was divided very strongly between pro and anti-Davey factions. And the anti-Davey faction either made their peace with the church or in many cases left the church and set up splinter groups of one sort or another. And it was in that atmosphere that Paisley's own brand of Presbyterianism prospered. And that's where he found his roots. And that's where his church was built upon those foundations. So it was very much a divided Presbyterian and Protestant community in Northern Ireland at that time. And you had also development of ecumenical movements, both political and religious, but particularly political. You had the Catholic Church, for example, undergoing all sorts of questioning. Pope John the 23rd called Vatican I, and there were various reforms that followed in that wake. Women were treated differently after that Vatican Council. Not that much differently, but certainly differently. Other aspects of the Catholic Church or Catholic dogma were softened. You know, the old image of the Pope being carried around on a big throne with a great big crown on his head, that faded, that went away, and the Catholic Church became much more modernized. And you had beginnings of the ecumenical movement. And the ecumenical movement was regarded by fundamentalist Protestants as a great threat to their own faith, because they saw their own religious leaders, particularly in the mainstream Presbyterian Church, responding to overtures from the Catholic hierarchy and from Catholic leaders. And they saw only danger in this. And Paisley was there to capitalize on that and warn that this was a road which was a very dangerous road that was going to lead to the dilution of their faith and their beliefs, and essentially to the takeover of Protestantism by a sort of bastardized semi-Catholic type of religion. So those were the circumstances in which Paisley was growing up, and which he became a minister and subsequently a political leader. And these various religious changes were being mirrored in the political world as well. You had a sort of religious ecumenism going on. You also had the stirrings of a political liberalism within unionism. You had Captain Terence O'Neill, who was a sort of rational unionist leader who realized that it was time for change and that you had to treat people like Catholics on a much more equal basis if you were going to have a decent society, et cetera, et cetera. And he was reaching out in a very timid way, admittedly, to the Catholic Church and to Catholic schools and Catholic leaders. But that was all alarm bells ringing as far as Paisley and his followers were concerned. And it was in that atmosphere of distrust, suspicion, anger, that was widespread within the Protestant community. I mean, it wasn't a minority, it was quite a substantial number of Unionists and Presbyterians and Baptists, what have you, were all fearful of where O'Neill was taking unionism. And Paisley was there at the right time. He was God's man for the moment, as they said.
Well, Ed, I was just going to ask you about an interview that Paisley did at the end of his career with Eamon Malley. And Malley was putting all these questions to him about the validity of the complaints of Catholics living in the North at the time about gerrymandering and discrimination and housing issues. And Paisley was agreeing with him and saying, well, that was awful in Derry, and it was awful about the job situations with county councils in Fermanagh and Tyrone. It does bring home to you in a lot of ways the cynicism of the campaign that you fought in the 60s.
Well, people have made that comment. There's no doubt about that. But I think at the time that he was leading the opposition to O'Neillism and the opposition to reformism within Northern Ireland state, I think he genuinely did believe that type of thing. And there's no doubt in my mind either that he went through all sorts of changes as his life, reached its end. And, he became a figure of respectability. He was no longer regarded as a madman or as a dangerous person or someone who was an obstacle. He was regarded as helpful. He was made a privy councillor. He was welcomed in, the highest levels of government in Britain, in Ireland, in America, and all this affects people, and Paisley was no different from anyone else. But I think at the time that he was leading the opposition to O'Neill and leading the opposition to sharing power with Catholics, I think he genuinely did believe that philosophy. And it was only later, of course, that when he made the deals that he did make to get into power, that he changed. And also there's the influence, I think, it can't be neglected. The influence of his wife, Eileen, I think was quite considerable. And there were always strong women in his life. His mother was a very, very strong woman, much stronger than his father. And Eileen, I think, played a similar sort of role to his mother in the sense that he, giving him advice and steering him from here and there and out of various difficult situations. And guiding him, I think. She was always there in the background. It's a famous photograph of him on the day that they took power with Martin McGuinness in the Northern Ireland Assembly, and he's outside at a microphone talking to the assembled press. And in the background, you can see Eileen holding her handbag and obviously knows about what he's saying. And I think that sort of picture captured the importance that she was there, making sure that he said the right things. And that was an important part of his life.
One of the things that I found most interesting in your biography of Paisley were the American influences. Well, you say there he's very much a North of Ireland Protestant. You do see the American influences there as well. What were they on him?
Well, it's Bob Jones, really. Bob Jones, Baptist. And again, this is one of the, strange aspects of Paisley's religious career. I mean, he was a free Presbyterian. He claimed to be part of the Presbyterian tradition. And his church did follow, by and large, the basic tenets of the Presbyterian Church. But he did also have baptism, which is unknown in the Presbyterian Church. Bob Jones, a Baptist, also a racist, in one of the most racist states in the United States, still is a racist state. And he got an awful lot of assistance from evangelicals in that part of the United States, both financial help, they helped to build his church, physically, the Martyrs Memorial, that is. And also they gave him, sort of academic cover, if you like. I mean, if you look at his qualifications, they're somewhat questionable, to say the least. He went to a very, questionable Bible college. Some people have raised all sorts of doubts about whether he was really qualified to be a preacher. Bob Jones solved all those problems for him and also helped him to build the church, the massive Martyrs Memorial Church in Belfast. So that was important for him. I think that mark is an embarrassment to a certain extent, because Bob Jones is regarded as a racist and his It's only very recently that black students were allowed into Bob Jones University. Nonetheless, there was still an atmosphere of racism and sort of right-wing American populist type of politics there. And Paisley has somehow survived that, or did survive it at that time.
Ian Paisley became known, first of all, as a firebrand preacher with an emphasis on kind of religious questions, but he became political leader in the 1960s, associated with kind of militant loyalism, and especially, well, throughout the 1960s, but especially with the advent of the civil rights movement in the late 1960s. Can you talk about that process and what was his position on the civil rights movement, and how did he become such a prominent kind of loyalist leader?
Well, because the direction that Terence O'Neill was taking unionism was setting, alarm bells ringing in the unionist community. They saw this softening of the attitudes towards nationalism as a dangerous thing, that it would weaken resolution, it would undermine the constitutional position of Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom. It would lead to a loss of political power. And for all of these reasons, Paisley was there leading the opposition to begin with the civil rights movement, which was asking for very basic reforms in terms of voting reforms and housing reforms and employment reforms and what have you. These were all regarded as very dangerous demands which could undermine the integrity of the Northern Ireland state. And Paisley was there voicing opposition to it, saying that this was a road that would lead in one direction and one direction only, and that was towards a united Ireland and to the undermining of the Protestant state and position of the Protestant religion in Ireland. And he became a very powerful voice, arguing, in a very eloquent and forceful way, persuaded an awful lot of ordinary Protestants to throw their lot in with him. That's was the basis of his power.
How much culpability do you think that Paisley had for the violence that erupted in the late 60s? Was it credible for him to disassociate himself from the people who were inspired by his rhetoric and sometimes very closely associated with him?
Well, there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that Paisley was up to his eyeballs in all the various efforts to undermine Terence O'Neill, and these took various forms. You've got to remember there was the first bombs that exploded during the Northern Ireland Troubles were in April 1969, and they were set by Loyalists in parts of County Down, meant to persuade people that they were really the work of the IRA when they, of course, were not. Paisley was somehow conveniently in jail when this happened, but there's absolutely no doubt that people who were involved in that, people like Sammy Stevenson and John McCaig, were all allies and confidants of Paisley, and that directly or indirectly, his hand and his influence was there. And those were the first acts of violence in the Northern Ireland Troubles. And Paisley was part of that. The Burntollet March, which was, when you look back at the history of the Troubles, I think most historians will now agree that the Burntollet March was an extraordinarily important moment where the idea of reforming the Northern Ireland state was replaced by the idea that the only way you could change things was to overthrow it. It laid the basis for the provisional IRA, in a sense. To remind you what the Burntollet March was, you had students wanting to repeat one of the famous experiences of the American Civil Rights March, a civil rights campaign, and lead a march right across the length and breadth of Northern Ireland, from Belfast to Derry. Derry, of course, was regarded as the cockpit of discrimination. And on the way, they were ambushed by Loyalists who were led by Major Ronald Bunting, who was Paisley's sidekick. The march was ambushed. Police more or less stood by while the students were attacked and pelted with rocks and beaten with cudgels and thrown into a river and what have you. And it was at that moment that the idea of reforming the Northern Ireland state died, I think, and set the tone for the emergence later that year of the provisional IRA after the events of August 1969. So Paisley was there. Paisley opposed the march. Paisley's associates and confidants, people like Bunting and McCaig, were part of the opposition, part of the organization against the Students' March. They were part of the plot to bomb reservoirs in Northern Ireland to make it appear as if the IRA was once again in action. That was all associated with Paisley. Without Paisley, would this have happened? Who knows? It's possible that it would never have happened. But he was there and he was responsible for it. And in that sense, he bears a huge amount of responsibility for the outbreak of the Troubles in August 1969. And again, if you look at what happened in August 69, look at the people who were involved on the Loyalist side in attacking Catholic homes. And there they are, people like John McCaig, who was, a very close associate of Paisley, prominent in the various acts of violence and petrol bombing and shooting and killing that was going on at that time. So Paisley's mark was all over the start of the Troubles.
It's interesting, though, to, I think, tease out like what Paisley's followers thought of the civil rights movement and what they thought they were doing. Like, for example, Gregory Campbell, who later on became a very prominent DUP, Paisleyite politician in Derry, said that the civil rights movement was demonstrating for rights that he didn't have as a working class Protestant, and he saw it as some sort of cover for a plot that was really to overthrow the state. How do you think like Paisley's followers saw the situation? Why did he have such appeal, at that time?
Well, I was a student at that time, and I was part of the civil rights movement in the sense that, we had this group called People's Democracy at Queen's, and, we had some of the very first marches for civil rights were students and led by People's Democracy people. And we would go down to the Unionist Party headquarters. So during this early period in 1969, there were various crisis meetings leading to the eventual resignation of Terence O'Neill. And we would go down there sort of like in a spirit of missionary zeal, if you like, to try to reach out to ordinary Unionists, ordinary Protestants who would be outside the Glen Gall Street headquarters, barracking and shouting and basically supporting Paisley against Terence O'Neill. And we would try to, have conversations with them about, what the civil rights movement was really about. It was about basic rights like housing, like employment. And we would say to them, what sort of house do you live in? And they, lived in Sandy Row, which was very close to the Unionist Party headquarters. And the houses in Sandy Row were no better, in fact, in many cases worse than the houses on the Forth Road. Outside toilets, no bathrooms inside, 2 up, 2 down, very basic, very poor, unhygienic, poor jobs, no voting rights because they weren't property owners. So they were all victims of the same sort of discrimination as Catholics were suffering. And it was just impossible to have a conversation about it with them. It was just that there was a blank stare when you tried to raise this sort of issue. No, it's nothing to do with that. They are the enemy. They are trying to overthrow Ulster. They're trying to get us all into a united Ireland. You really couldn't reach out. It was almost impossible to have a rational conversation with them and say, look, actually, a lot of what the civil rights movement is looking for, you need it as well. It was a waste. It was a waste of time, a waste of effort.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me, this mindset. But I suppose, it's incumbent on us to understand it. And I suppose, is it driven by fear? Is that what drives that mindset?
It is very difficult to understand what it's about. It's at the end of the day, it's down to bigotry. And you have the same phenomenon over here in the United States. With white attitudes towards the black population. There's an irrationality there which is almost impossible to overcome. And it was the same. The comparisons are not exactly the same, but they're pretty similar. In Northern Ireland, that attitudes on the part of ordinary working class Unionists and Protestants to their Catholic neighbours were racist, essentially. And there's no way that you can have a rational conversation to overcome that. And that was essentially part of the problem, was that you were dealing with a really racist society at the end of the day.
Now, Ed, we might move on to the Democratic Unionist Party, the party that Paisley set up in 1971, when the violence had really kicked off and was very, very serious in Northern Ireland. On your website, The Broken Elbow, I've read some of the articles that you've written about somebody that most people wouldn't be aware of or wouldn't have heard of, Desmond Bowl, and also in your biography too. What type of influence do you think somebody like Bowl would have had over Paisley and his political views at that time?
He had a lot of influence, right up to the very end. Paisley would often, go to see Desmond and talk to him about, political events and get his advice. He was very influential at the outset of Paisley's career. He was a Derry man, and he got involved in sort of fundamental. He was a barrister, of course, as well. He got involved in very sort of weird causes at the time in the 1950s and early 1960s. In one particular case, there was a divorce between a Catholic man in Fethard-on-Sea and his Protestant wife, and the child was taken by, I think it was taken by the husband, and Bowl tried to intervene to try to persuade the parent who had the child to hand it over to the Protestant parent so that he could be brought up as a Protestant. And it became a cause célèbre at the time, and it led to a boycott of Protestants in Fethard-on-Sea, and made Bowl a bit of a personality, and that led him into Paisley's orbit, and that's when the relationship began. And Paisley regarded Bowl very much as a friend and also an advisor. And when Paisley decided to set up the Democratic Unionist Party, it was basically at Bowl's instigation that this happened. Bowl was there at his side when DUP was formed. He was the one who advised Paisley to change the name from Protestant Unionist to Democratic Unionist so that it would have a wider appeal amongst the Protestant population. And he was by his side during some of the most important events of that particular time. And there was a very famous occasion in which he and Paisley met up with a group of journalists in the Europa Hotel. And this has been November 1971. Liam Hurricane of RT was there, and Vincent Brown, who was, I think, working for the Irish Press, was there. And they talked all through the night. And it ended in the most extraordinary way, with Paisley being persuaded that the idea of a united Ireland in which the Catholic Church would not have the sort of influence that it had in the 26 county state as it existed then was something which he could possibly live with. And he gave an interview to RTE, and he gave an interview to Vincent Brown. I think there was another guy there from the Independent, I forget his name, but anyway, he got a huge amount of coverage in the media at that time, and sort of led to speculation that either Paisley has gone mad or he's like entirely changed his views. And of course, he realized very quickly when dawn broke the next day that he had made a huge mistake, and he withdrew from it and retracted an awful lot of what he'd said. But that was down or regarded as being mostly the responsibility of Desmond Bowl. And Desmond, as I said, had been a major influence in formation of the DUP. That sort of marked really the end of his public association with Desmond Bowl, although the pair continued to meet and Paisley would continue to go to him for advice on things. But that was an extraordinary episode, but it raised all sorts of weird questions about Paisley's judgment. And this, what persuaded him to do this when he must have known, and it wouldn't take, much sense to realize this, that what he was suggesting here was political suicide. And of course, he had to do an immediate U-turn, in the days after that. And but it stands out as an episode which raises really, big questions about Paisley's judgment in all of this. Well, we don't know the answers yet. We still don't know the answers to that.
Well, it does present us the question of whether Paisley in private was a much less sectarian and more conciliatory person than the public image would have us believe.
Yeah, it does raise that question, but also raise the question of how much of it was just an act, how much of it was pretense, was that this is what he had to do in order to build up his church, to build up his political following. To what extent did he mean all of this stuff? When you look at the end of his career and the contrast between the beginning of his career, he ended up sharing power with former chief of staff of the IRA, Martin McGuinness, who was nonetheless at the time that the talks were taking place that led to the formation of the government with Paisley and the provost. McGuinness was Northern Commander of the IRA. He was in charge of all the IRA's operations in the 6 counties and responsible for all of the violence that took place, and had been for many years. Paisley knew that. And yet, he was quite prepared to put that aside and go into government with him. And I think that shocked an awful lot of his supporters. And I don't think they've ever really recovered from it. And I can remember, talking to DUP people in the wake of all of that. And when they saw the television pictures of Paisley, admittedly not sitting beside, but sitting at an angle with Jerry Adams to announce the formation of their government, the shock was enormous to the grassroots. And I don't think the DUP has ever really recovered. There was a leadership in the DUP which was going to do well no matter what happened. They would become members of the assembly, they would become ministers, they would have salaries, they would have special advisors, they would have chauffeurs, they would have drivers, they'd have this, they'd have that. The deal made an awful lot of sense to them, but to the ordinary DUP person who saw this volte-face on the part of Paisley, it was a shock from which I don't think they've ever really recovered. And I can remember at that time going back to Northern Ireland and talking to DUP people that I'd known for a long time, and they were just like, they were knocked sideways. They just could not deal with it. What does that say about Paisley and Paisleyism? One can understand, the Robinsons and the Dodds and various other people that we know who've risen to the top of the DUP. They're professional politicians. They're seeking office, they're seeking power, and so on and so forth. But the average DUP supporter was almost like a member of a cult, a religion. They really believed in everything that the organization stood for, and they believed that there were certain steps that would never be taken, certain concessions that could never be taken. And here they were, looking at, while the media were raving about Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley sitting together, grinning on steps of Stormont, they were in a state of absolute shock and horror. And I don't think most of them have recovered from that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it's interesting though. I mean, you talk about his true believers and especially the people who combined kind of political and religious belief in him. But kind of another slightly different group, I think, were the Loyalist paramilitaries, the really militant Loyalists, the ones who used violence. The impression I've always got from Loyalist testimony is that they never really cared for Paisley all that much. They never saw him as really one of them. Like, they didn't think he was really sincere, I think.
They regarded him as a coward. That was their real complaint about him, that he was quite prepared to urge people to do this, that, and the other, but would make sure that he was nowhere in sight when the consequences had to be faced up to. And I remember Tommy Little, who was a former leader of the UDA on the Shankill, told me this story about August 1969, when the troubles really started, if you like, and you had big riots and gun battles taking place on the peace line between the Falls and the Shankill Road, ending up with Bombay Street, for example, being burned to the ground and people being killed and so on and so forth. And he said he saw Paisley surrounded by a bunch of women, and he was trying to force his way through the women, but not with a great deal of vigor, saying, I have to go over there and help. And they were pulling him back, saying, Dr. Paisley, you can't go there. You'll get killed if you go, And this was this huge, big man, towering over these wee women, could easily have forced his way past them and made his way to the scene of the action, but didn't. And Tommy took from that Paisley essentially deep at heart was a coward. And that's the image which has stuck with the Loyalist paramilitaries down the years. He was strong with the words, but weak with the action. And for example, during the UWC strike in 1974, he managed to absent himself and go to Canada during the most crucial period, had some excuse about family and business that had to be settled in Canada. His brother living out there. May have been true, may not have been true, but that was the wrong time to go. And that's the sort of attitude that the Loyalist paramilitaries have towards deep suspicion, a belief that he was a coward, belief that he was on the make, unreliable, and someone to be avoided.
Now, in the 1980s, after the Anglo-Irish Agreement, which of course he was ferociously against, and he made a famous speech outside City Hall in Belfast, but he did kind of flirt with setting up his own paramilitary organisation called Ulster Resistance for a time, didn't he?
Yes, but if you look at the history of that, he soon retreated from it when it became clear that it was really intent on doing serious stuff. If you remember the story about Ulster Resistance, together with the UDA and the UVF, they organised a bank robbery in Portadown, which netted, I think, £300,000 or £400,000, and they used that money to buy arms in via South Africa. It was very complicated, but it came from the arms came from the Middle East, but the deal was sort of facilitated by South African intelligence, and they brought all this weaponry over to Northern Ireland. The Ulster Resistance was the DUP's armed wing, in a sense, if you remember those days, they were wearing red berets and marching up and down streets of Portadown, Loyalist areas in various parts of Northern Ireland. The action was supposed to come via this armed shipment. And when Paisley found out about the armed shipment, he distanced himself at the speed of knots from Ulster Resistance. And again, the message was, Paisley talks the talk, but he will never walk the walk. And I think that cost him at the end of the day when he articulated his opposition to the peace deal that Trimble made with Sinn Féin and the British government and the Irish government. People took that with a very large pinch of salt. Well, I mean by people is Loyalist base. So, on the one hand, yes, Paisley could be branded a coward, but at the same time, you could argue that that was a good thing for Northern Ireland, because if Paisley had really been up to the mark in relation to that type of activity, Northern Ireland's history would have been very, very different. You would not have seen, it took someone like a Paisley of that ilk to do a deal with Sinn Féin, to do a deal with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness. A tougher, a more principled Loyalist leader would never have done it.
It's interesting, though, regarding the politics, throughout the Troubles, there were various attempts, as you know, Ed, to solve it on a political basis. And you had the Sunningdale Agreement, which was brought down by the Loyalist strike in 1974, the Anglo-Irish Agreement and so on. But very much this idea of power sharing. And this is also, of course, the linchpin of the Good Friday Agreement. And throughout the period, Paisley's political position, I think, was returned to pre-1969, wasn't it? It was just that nothing needs to change in Northern Ireland.
That's right, yes. That was his attitude throughout. But, if you really believe that, why would you get involved in talks about a settlement unless you knew what the terms, when you agreed to play a football match, you play by the rules, and the rules are you don't foul, and this is how you score a goal, and this is how this is done and how that's done. You follow what everyone else is doing, and you agree to the terms of the game. If Paisley really was opposed deep down to sharing power with nationalists or Catholics, to moderating his views, he would never have had any discussions. He would never have got involved in talks at all. He would have always been on the outside shouting "sell out." But no, he got involved. And when you get involved in a process such as the one that led to Good Friday Agreement or the St. Andrews Agreement, if you get involved in that process, you know where it's going to go. You're going to have to make concessions. You're going to have to bend this and bend that principle. And, you're going to have to, at the end of the day, share power with someone who's your enemy. I mean, he knew very well, dealing with people like Gerry Adams, who's been on the Army Council of the IRA since, 1978. Martin McGuinness, who's been Northern Commander of the IRA for previous 10, 15 years. He knows this. He knows these facts, or he knew these facts. Yeah. And if he was really, really opposed to the notion of having anything to do with these people, he would never have got involved in the process. But he did get involved in the process. And as soon as he got involved in the process, and it was just a question of how and when a deal was going to be made, and that's exactly what happened.
But Ed, why do you think Paisley survived for so long, and why do you think he saw off so many other unionist leaders and outmaneuvered them too?
Because they were all scared of him, because he had this reputation of always being right in terms of spotting a sellout. He appeared to most of his followers for most of the time to be trenchant, to be thoroughly principled. He could command enormous loyalty amongst his followers. He had a huge amount of support within the Northern Ireland Protestant community. So he was a very powerful figure. And for all of these reasons, I think he was successful. It took the passage of time and events, I think, for a rather different image of Ian Paisley to come to the fore. The one that we now, I think, would now choose to regard him as being someone who was, at the end of the day, prepared to moderate and to compromise. But the early Paisley in particular, was a very different kettle of fish altogether as far as, Loyalist politics was concerned.
Ed, I'm just thinking that for most of the 70s and 80s and even the 90s, if you were to ask people in Britain to name a single Irish politician, the only person the vast majority of them could name was Ian Paisley, and they couldn't really name anyone else. How was Paisley perceived in Britain?
Oh, as I think he was probably perceived as being very Irish to begin with. There was no phenomenon in British society that was equivalent to him. It was a throwback to a different age, dangerous, strange, sometimes comical, all of these things. But at the end of the day, he became a bit of a hero, didn't he? I mean, he did the deal with the Provosts. He brought peace to Northern Ireland. He brought an end to the Troubles. So I think you're probably remembered, no matter what the early memories and the early image of Paisley was. At the end of the day, he's the guy who maybe, deserves the most credit for bringing the Troubles to an end. Because if Paisley opposed the deal, whatever the deal was going to be, it was always in danger of falling. It was always in danger of collapsing, always danger of being undermined. When Paisley put his name to the final agreement, then that was the end of the Troubles, because there was no one who could out Paisley. So that was his value. And I rather think that's the way he's going to be remembered by most historians. I think, as I've tried to suggest, the picture is a wee bit more complicated than that. But at the end of the day, people will see Ian Paisley as the man who brought the Troubles to an end.
Well, I remember watching footage of one of David Trimble's election counts, and it was a time when Trimble would have been First Minister. And it's just enormous violence coming from the DUP supporters at the election count. And I think he has to be dragged into his car, him and his wife looked really distressed, trying to keep these people away from him. And it did seem incredibly hypocritical to think that the same DUP party would be doing exactly what Trimble would be doing in a couple of years' time. Of course.
Well, you could say that about other participants in the Troubles. I mean, Sinn Féin, for example, would attack the SDLP for making deals with unionists, and yet they made exactly the same deals themselves with unionists. That's politics, I guess. I think most people will not complain because the end product was the end of the Troubles, was the end of the violence. People weren't being killed. There was a certain amount of stability. It's no guarantee that the Troubles won't somehow re-emerge in some shape or form, but they're over. And they're over because people who had built their reputations and their support on their willingness never, or their unwillingness to compromise, ended up compromising. Paisley amongst them, and the provost as well. I mean, if you had said in 1969, August 1969, when Bombay Street was on fire and gunfire was echoing around the streets of West Belfast, that this violence, this political turmoil in Northern Ireland would end with Ian Paisley and the leadership of the IRA sitting down together and sharing power at Stormont. They say, you're absolutely bananas, you're mad, you're crazy. But that's how it ended. And I think, at the end of the day, that's all that matters. And that's how Paisley will be, I think, remembered as a good guy at the end of the day. He did the right thing at the end of the day. Just as Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who, between them, I don't know how many deaths they are responsible for, directly or indirectly, but a huge number of deaths, will also be regarded in the same favorable light. They did the deal, they ended the thing, and we're now living in a better place as a result.
I think it's funny about the likes of Paisley is that in some ways, I think for people from the South, with all the sectarian talk and his record, he didn't seem as sectarian as the likes of a Willie McRae or other people in his party. And he seemed more personable and more humorous than a lot of his party colleagues.
Well, yeah, that's because they tend to see Paisley in his recent manifestations rather than his early manifestations, The difference is that someone like Willie McRae, who actually, has ended up being barracked himself by, his own right wing in the DUP, because he opposed the deal that initially opposed the deal that Paisley signed up for, and then changed his mind and came under enormous amount of criticism and stick from Loyalists in his part of Derry, South Derry, as a result. They're not alone, people change, people modify their views. Paisley is regarded now in a very favorable light. Does he deserve that? Well, yes and no. Yes, he did end the thing, but he also started it, So how do you square that circle?
Now, Ed, you mentioned before in the context of the DUP's compromises over the last 10 or 15 years that the party's base was dismayed and shocked by this. Now, with Ian Paisley dead and with, the situation in Northern Ireland again somewhat in flux as a result of Brexit and so on, Paisley is dead, but is Paisleyism dead? This combination of kind of religious and political zeal on the side of the Loyalist people. Is that in the past? Is that credible in today's Northern Ireland?
It's difficult to say. I'm not living there now, so I don't experience it in the way that I did when I was living there. So I'm really possibly the last person you should ask that question to. But I do have a feeling, though, that there is a fundamental change underneath the surface, which is that Catholics are getting a better deal in Northern Ireland than they ever did in the past. Support, therefore, for bringing down the state or for opposing the state is much less acute than it used to be. That has an equal beneficial impact upon the unionist population in the sense that they regard nationalists in a much more sympathetic light or much more favorable light than they would have done during the Troubles. And I think that all adds together to make the situation very different than it was when the Troubles were at their worst. And therefore, the likelihood that it could reignite into the sort of violence that we have for so many years, I think it's very, very unlikely now. I think essentially it's over. It's over because most people want it to be over. They may still have huge differences about the end product, but as long as they're not killing each other and not fighting, I think most people will be happy with whatever is agreed in terms of their political future.
Do you think Paisley was bitter with the way his leadership of both the DUP and the Free Presbyterian Church ended?
I think he was, yes, obviously. I mean, it was his church and it was his party. He had created both of them. Neither would have existed without him. Neither would have grown to the extent and to the influence that they did have without him. Then he's rejected. And I think the blow that hurt the most was being turfed out of his own church which he had founded. And I think that really, really hurt him so badly. I don't think he ever really recovered from it. The political side was something he could deal with, that's politics, but religion was what he was really at the end of the day all about. This was his church, he had created it. The congregations existed because of him, the following existed because of him, and here they were at the end of the day saying, you sold us out you go, you're no longer one of us, get you out from amongst us. That hurt, I think that hurt him terribly. And I don't think he ever really recovered from it. It was really, the church was really what he was all about at the end of the day, much more than the politics. The idea that he could actually be thrown out, rejected by his own people. I think that almost killed him.
Well, Ed, thank you very, very much for coming on today. We really appreciate your time. And you can find Ed's work on thebrokenelbow.com. That's his website. So you can listen to this and previous episodes of the show on our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryShow or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And if you get a chance, please rate and review the episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. So until next time, my name is Cathal Brennan. On behalf of myself, my co-host John Dorney from theirishstory.com, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.